Greetings to everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today my guest is Andreas Umland, a preeminent expert on the Eastern matters, dealing with Ukraine, Russia, European security. Right now based in Kiev, which is an interesting thing. Because the institution with which Andreas is embedded now or working with has such a long name, and I couldn't memorize it. So it would be best if you could say it with your own words, so that it's not confused at all.
Well, the institution is called briefly Ukrainian Institute for the Future, which is a relatively new think tank here in Kiev, and the program I'm working within is called Program on European Regional and Russian Studies, and headed by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Pavlo Klimkin.
Okay, very nice. So once we are through, the opening shots of our conversation, let me quickly get back to the most critical thing. What is the future of Ukraine? What is your take on that?
Well, it depends. Ukraine has an open future, and the problem here, judging about it from Kiev, is that the crucial decisions, I think, will not be taken in Kiev. In Kiev, there had to be taken crucial decisions in the past, and we had here the Orange Revolution, the Euromaidan Revolution. But as I see it now, although we have wavering here in Kiev about the exact kind of foreign political and domestic orientation, there is a certain variety of paths that the different parties propose here. The general direction is very clear. It's towards the European and Euro-Atlantic community, and all the major parties are in one camp in that regard. Not in other regards for 100%, but this general direction is clear, and the major decisions are then going to be made about Kiev, as this direction has been already decided here in Kiev in these two big uprisings in 2004 and 2013, 2014. The major decisions are going to be made in Moscow, Brussels, and Washington. This is where I guess the future of Ukraine will be decided. Ukraine is unfortunately too small to have a big say in all of this. It can only try to persuade the different parties that they will follow a course that will eventually support Ukraine, make it more resilient. The main question here, I guess, about the future is resilience, security, and international embeddedness. These are, I would say, the crucial issues here in Ukraine.
Interestingly, that you mentioned the foreign capitals that would decide the future of Ukraine. So in a way, the future of Ukraine is hanging on the balance of power across Eurasia, and the result of the current turbulent times of the U.S.-China showdown, the U.S.-Russia and Russia against Europe, or Russia vis-a-vis Europe affairs. Mm-hmm. So let me get back to it in a while. For example, why didn't you mention Warsaw? And that's a rhetoric question, or at least a controversial question, but worth maybe debating. Why it's missing on the mental map, given the map and geography. Why Warsaw is missing from this equation? Or Berlin.
I will happily comment on this.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I guess Warsaw also has a fairly straightforward policy towards Ukraine, and also, as far as I can see it from Kiev, which is very, very common in all major political forces, it's very supportive of Ukraine. But what I gathered when I was in Warsaw is that Warsaw is not becoming as engaged in Ukraine as it could be, because it's not sure about its own security, and that any engagement that Warsaw may make in Ukraine, a further reaching engagement, maybe even in the security sphere, in the military sphere, would perhaps endanger then Warsaw and Poland and the embeddedness of Poland in NATO, for instance. And that is at least what I gathered in Warsaw, that the sympathy is very high in Warsaw, in all major political camps and in the intellectual sphere. But the hesitation that I still see in Warsaw's engagement for Ukraine has a lot to do with Polish national security interests that nobody wants to risk, which is perfectly understandable. And in that way, I would still think that Brussels and Washington have to play a major role, because they have to reassure actors like Warsaw and also Vilnius and Tallinn and Riga that their security will not be undermined if they more strongly engage with Ukraine and for Ukraine. I think that is the main worry that, at least as I feel it, is widespread in Eastern Europe, that there is a lot of sympathy in general for Ukraine, but all of these countries from Estonia down to Bulgaria, they are still not sure about their own security and their own place in NATO and in the European Union, and that's why they are hesitant. And they are looking to Brussels and to Washington, and maybe also to Berlin and Paris, for signals on how they should and can behave, how far they can go in their engagement with Ukraine and also with Moldova and Georgia.
Again, very interesting perspective. But maybe let me draw a picture of the model grand strategy that Poland would like to have. But you are right that we are at the crossroads. Actually, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we really believed in the end of history. And we went to beauty sleep, not thinking strategically in our own interests. So we simply joined with the West and NATO and European Union. And the grand policy was made beyond Warsaw. Because we really believed in the sort of cohesion of interest and within the Western community. Right now we are waking up and we are at the crossroads. And if we are waking up, that will mean a different Poland. Because then Ukraine is our national interest number one, and Belarus, not the Baltic states. So far, we have exercised what I called, and you call this phrase, strategic restraint. For example, we didn't take part in the Minsk and other formats of discussions between Paris and Russia and Germans, because we believed in the cohesion of the West. So we didn't do anything to undermine the cohesion of the collective West. But if the contours of the new system emerges where we see the conflicting interest, Poland will start to play its own game, and then Ukraine will become priority number one. For example, Poland will block any new agreements over Ukraine because, geography still matters, and without Poland, you can't do anything to help or consolidate Ukraine or do anything. Actually, at the end of the day, Poland could negate all agreements where we're not sitting on the table, and we are slowly waking up to grasp this reality. If, for example, the French behave as they behave, trying to drag the Russians into the balancing game into Europe, okay? So, and I noticed many occasions that our Western partners grew used to Poland not taking a stand so much that they believe that this is a normal thing. So it's not. And a few days ago, there was already a famous article in where was it? I think in the Atlantic Council. I don't remember now. By the Ukraine minister, calling for a change of format and inviting Poland and other countries of the region into the format. This is a symptom that the Ukrainians are grasping the changing balance of power and the sort of a dissolution of the current system. We will see what Poland will do, but we are entering a very turbulent times. This is why I provocatively ask you why Warsaw is missing from the picture, and it is missing. You're right. For example, Ukraine is not part of the 3 Seas initiative. Ukraine is not part of 17+1 initiative. Poland didn't do anything, although we wanted Ukraine in, but we didn't do anything politically to draw it in, because we exercise strategic restraints, and I think that this era is coming to an end.
Well, many in Kiev would hope so. I would say that Poland would get more engaged with Ukraine.
Yeah, it's nice. But what about the Western Europeans? What about Berlin and Paris? What the European project would say about that? You know, what is your take on that? Whether we still have the collective West perspective, whether we are capable as Europe to really have a cohesive policy, or already it's a daydreaming.
Well, I can't say much about France, which I don't know well. I can only say about Germany that the German landscape is now very divided on this Eastern policy. I would even venture to speculate that if we had to take the decision now on Nord Stream 2, if it had not been built already almost completely, I think now perhaps Berlin would not start this project, because now I think the awareness of the geopolitical complications in Eastern Europe has risen. The Green Party in Germany, that is now doing better in opinion polls than it used to be, and it may become the second largest party in the next Bundestag, has taken a stand against Nord Stream 2. And in most of the other parties, namely in the Christian Democratic Party, Social Democratic Party, and Liberal Democratic Party, you have now divided opinions on Nord Stream 2. Maybe less so in the Social Democratic Party, but the Christian Democrats and the Liberal Democrats are now very divided on that. And so this is very much in flux now also in Germany, and it's difficult to say where at the end of the next election cycle Germany will come out with what kind of chancellor and what kind of governing coalition, which party will get the foreign ministry, also who will become the next federal president of Germany, which is not a very important office, but still has some importance. So Germany is also in flux, and the situation in the EU, I think, is also rather unpredictable because the number of actors is, of course, very high. Each of them has a veto power, basically, on such decisions as Nord Stream 2, or not Nord Stream 2, but the sanctions. Yeah, I see that also that we are in a transition period, as you mentioned or indicated, and that maybe indeed the geopolitics of Eastern Europe will change, and maybe there will be a certain diversion in the foreign policies of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and that would be, of course, very, very unfortunate in terms of the sort of all-European project. But if the interests are too diverging, if we, for instance, get, let's say, let's perhaps mention a worst-case scenario, Marine Le Pen as the next French president with a very pro-Russian position, then I would say that the foreign policy of the EU is over, and of the West is also over, if one still regards that such a common foreign policy is indeed existing, and then we would have indeed a very different situation. And then I guess indeed for countries like Ukraine, this sort of East European partnership, which I would liberally use the term intermarium for, would be the best way to go. And I would, in any way, I would even say that even if things turn out pretty well, let's say in the next German and French elections, and we can sort of keep this basic consensus. I think for a transition period, I think this East European cooperation may be leading up to some sort of formalization, even like the inclusion of Ukraine in the Three Seas initiative, would be a good strategy for this interregnum before Ukraine enters the EU and NATO anyway necessary. So it's not only for a worst case scenario, but even for a best case scenario, I would say that Ukraine is not going to be soon a member of either NATO or the EU. The same goes probably for Moldova and Georgia, and there's nothing else left for Ukraine and also Georgia and Moldova than to build a more resilient, more advanced, and maybe also more formalized bilateral or bilateral relations in Eastern Europe, or preferably multilateral relations in Eastern Europe. So, so I agree with you that we are now in this transition period, and I guess many people here in Kiev would welcome very much a more active role of Poland in all of this. The problem here with such formats as Minsk is, of course, or Normandy format, is that Russia does not want that, and they will simply not participate if Poland comes in. That's my fear, that the aversion to Poland is so high that they will simply say, no, if Poland is in, then we are out, and then these sort of, these formats like Normandy and Minsk, they then become senseless without Russia participating. So, so that is, I think, also a major problem in this whole East European setting, that the tensions between Poland and Russia are so high that it's going to be basically either or. Whatever format there will be, it's either with Poland and then without Russia, or something with Russia and then without Poland.
You might be right. You might be right. Let me ask the following question. If we agree that we are entering the turbulent times of transition, and you mentioned the West, East, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the center of gravity moving this, what at least I gathered from your words. So where is Germany there, that is located in der Mitte, this Mittellage? Where is Germany heading for?
Well, also, although I'm German and I'm, of course, following very carefully the sort of discussion in Berlin, I find it difficult to read the future foreign policy of Germany. If you just take the current foreign minister, Heiko Maas, he was at the beginning of his term quite hawkish on Russia. He then became more dovish, but then he went to the, if I'm not mistaken, to the last summit of the Three Seas initiative. Yeah, so he, even with one person, you don't know quite where he stands. He's sort of, and the composition also of the elite is changing. You still have Gerhard Schröder exerting his influence on all of this. He has still a weighty voice, at least within the Social Democratic Party, but also as a representative of German economic interests. So it's difficult to read which way Germany will go. Also, the candidates for the chancellorship, probably Angela Merkel is going to go next year, as she announced. Some people still speculate that she may sort of reverse her decision to leave the political scene. I don't think so. I think she will actually leave, as she has said. And then we have, even within the Christian Democratic camp, which includes the Christian Social Union of Bavaria, we have very different candidates for the chancellorship in terms of Eastern policies or policies towards Russia. So we have with Armin Laschet a candidate for the chancellorship from the CDU who is perhaps more on the side of the traditional social democratic approach to Russia and to Eastern Europe. Then we have a candidate called Norbert Röttgen, who is sort of an Atlanticist, quite hawkish on Russia, pro-Ukrainian, who would probably be very welcome in cities like Warsaw and Kiev. And then we have Markus Söder from Bavaria, who comes out of a party that has been quite dovish on at least a part of the most influential party leaders. Edmund Stoiber and Horst Seehofer have been very dovish on Russia, and also sort of restrictive on a future accession of Ukraine to the European Union. But maybe Söder is still different, because also even within the Christian Social Union of Bavaria, you have different factions. So there is a more pro-Western, pro-Atlanticist faction even within this party. And then there are these people like Edmund Stoiber and Horst Seehofer, who have this sort of more dovish approach towards Russia. So it's very difficult for me to read what will come out of this cocktail in the future. So far, it's all, the whole Eastern policies are basically built around the person of Angela Merkel. She's very much dominating it. And, you know, she's, I guess, more important here in this part of foreign policy than actually the Minister of Foreign Affairs, because she has sort of taken a strong interest in Ukraine, which is very much acknowledged here in Ukraine as well. Ukrainians have come to really like Angela Merkel, which was not always the case, but she's now very popular here, and they fear her departure next year, and they ask me all the time what will happen then to Germany and how will Germany behave towards Ukraine, and I don't know. I have to say frankly, because there's as I tried to illustrate, a very complicated cocktail of different factions within the parties, not so much actually perhaps division, or not only division among the parties, but even within the parties you have very different foreign policy approaches, and especially Eastern policy approaches, and who eventually will get the crucial posts is still difficult to say.
Again, very interesting. Thank you for sharing this insight from the sometimes not transparent for outsiders, the German factions. I just political life aside, politicians aside, what does German industry say, Andreas?
Well, so far they have clearly the strongest interest in Eastern Europe is clearly Russia, and that's because Russia is larger, and also because it's about energy, and it's mainly about energy, not only, but to a large degree about energy. And that's a complicated issue to communicate here in Ukraine, where many people see the Germans as sort of being anti-Russian, although, these people, I know some of them personally, they don't care about, these sort of political and geopolitical issues. It has simply to do something with the trade flows, and the Ukrainian trade flow with Germany is very small, and with Russia is maybe not so much in terms of the value that is being exchanged. Russia is actually not that important for German industry and German trade. Poland, for instance, is much more important. Even the Czech Republic has a larger trade with Germany. But with Russia, it's about energy, and energy is crucial. And that's why you have still this strong faction, influential faction in Germany that is pushing Nord Stream 2, and which all eventually I'm afraid actually will lead to the completion of Nord Stream 2, but just because energy is too important to not complete this project at this stage. So, but maybe this will change now also, because energy, the role of energy seems to be changing in world politics as a result of the corona crisis. The prices have gone down. There are different predictions for the future, whether the prices will go up again. Some people say they may be as high as $150 per barrel next year already. Some others say that it will never go up again because, just the world is changing and that we will have a different kind of industry in the future. So that's also difficult to predict right now. If indeed the role of energy of fossil energy resources will change in the future and go down, then perhaps also the German industry's approach to Eastern Europe may change. Then simply Russia becomes less interesting. And then perhaps even a country like Ukraine could become more interesting with the association agreement and with a simple geographic position, the labor force here, the fertile soil here. So perhaps this is also changing now. I would hope so. I certainly hope so that perhaps because of the corona crisis, the importance of Russia for German industry will decline.
Look how many things have changed over the last 30 years. West Germany was directed towards Atlantic, the intra-German border, not so much of business in the east. And now you're sitting in Kiev, we're talking what Ukraine will do. Energy, strategic flows from Russia, Poland and Czech Republic, former Soviet Warsaw Pact countries, connected actually to German economy. I'm asking about the German industry. So are we gone with Adenauer's Westbindung? Or is it being undermined in the German debate that the German role has changed with the accession of the Eastern countries into EU? The center of gravity of the German supply chain and the industry has moved eastwards, diminishing the role of France and increasing actually its own role as Germany and in cooperation with the Central and Eastern Europe. Can you address all those issues that I asked? And on top of that, in China that is coming with Belt and Road, great market for German industry, connectivity across Eurasia. Doesn't it sound great for the continent-based German economy?
Well, I would say the Westbindung, the connection to the West, the embeddedness of Germany in the West is not changing. The main problem here has actually been simply Mr. Trump in the last years, I would say, and this sort of the turning away of the US from Europe. But I wouldn't see it in as dramatic terms. Obviously, the gravity of the European Union is changing now that Great Britain is leaving. Although I would venture to speculate that maybe Great Britain will be back again at some point, as embarrassing as that would be, because the opinion polls seem to suggest that the young people in Britain support the European Union and they regret the Brexit. So maybe that is only a temporary phenomenon. But in spite of this sort of change of gravity, I would see this such a change in the German direction. I think the Europeanness of Germany is rather increasing or has increased, and I would say will further increase. This sort of traditional multilateral approach will not change. Whoever will be the next chancellor, I think that is not something that will change. This sort of definition of German interests as being congruent with EU interests. So I'm not as skeptical in that regard. I'm more skeptical with the approach to Russia. That could be changing for the worse from my perspective after the elections. But in general, I think this sort of multilateral European approach to foreign policy will not change. And if we have a new president in the US, as I see it now being likely in November, then also the Atlantic link will be strengthened again, and maybe it will be different than in the past. But I think that this estrangement from the US has been basically a result of Mr. Trump's sort of rhetoric, which is also culturally quite difficult to stomach for Germans. He's simply a kind of speaker, not just president, but also speaker, who speaks in a very sort of un-German way, if you like. Although he likes to emphasize his German roots, he's very different from how Germans approach world politics. And that's why I think once he is gone, actually the German-American relationship will be restored.
So, given the fact that we have Ukraine, which is Polish national strategic interest, maybe number 2 after Belarus. Mm-hmm. So we have this arc of instability. Lukashenko's Belarus, Ukraine in turmoil. We have the Baltic states, where we still debate whether they are secure or insecure in terms of the guarantees. Yeah, so we have this intermarium from the Gulf of Riga to Gulf of Odessa, with Poland as a sort of a pivot holding it.
Yes.
Do Germans talk about it? Do Germans talk about the future of this, what we call the Eastern frontier in Polish language, or the buffer zones between Russia and Poland? And as you know, you're based in Kiev, so you know that Poles have this sort of a approach. So is it a debate like that in Germany?
Unfortunately not. I've tried to, with a number of articles, to introduce this term intermarium in Germany, and others have tried to do that too. Unfortunately, in Germany, that is not a popular concept because it is an obviously anti-Putinist or anti-Russian imperialist concept. And the German approach here is that that Russia has to be involved into European affairs and has to be tied to Europe, and that is also in a way an understandable approach, but much less understandable from Warsaw or Kiev or Tallinn. And that's why this concept is almost, I think, remains almost unknown in Germany. And once you start talking about it, Germans don't like it, because they immediately understand that it's mainly about the intermarium. In the interwar period, it was also anti-German, or it was meant to be a security coalition also against German imperialism, but now, and Soviet or Russian imperialism, and now it's mainly about Russian imperialism, obviously. So, that is why I was actually surprised that Heiko Maas went to this Three Seas Initiative summit, or I'm not sure was it a summit or was it a meeting, but that is already encouraging, actually, that Germany would go as far. I'm also encouraged that Austria is part of the Three Seas Initiative. That is also a good sign. Who's missing, or the countries that are missing are obviously Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And I'm including here Georgia, which is not obviously geographically part of this area, but it also has an association agreement with the EU, and I would say that is more important than the geography, and that's why Georgia should be also included in all of that. So I think with Germany, you can't discuss much the intermarium. I think the intermarium should be discussed with NATO and with the US. I think there people understand it much better, the idea of the intermarium. And here, what I would say maybe the most important thing is that NATO and the US are going to reassure Warsaw and Vilnius and Tallinn and perhaps even Bucharest and Bratislava, if they engage, that their security, as I mentioned at the beginning, that your security is taken care of, and that they have your backs, and that they will protect you. You know, if you include Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia into the 3 Cs initiative, I could even imagine that the Bucharest 9 group could be redefined as not an intra-NATO group, but a group that would actually also include perhaps not Moldova, but Ukraine and Georgia that have this enhanced opportunities program now with NATO. So you could redefine the Bucharest 9 group as not being an intra-NATO structure. So if that happens, and if Washington and Brussels support it, then I could see here something new emerging. But I think Germany is for that particular issue, I'm afraid, not the right partner. It's simply a kind of thinking, geopolitical thinking, that is not very popular in Germany.
Two quick questions on that. If we let's assume that we have the scenario that really United States, even after elections, move away from Europe, that's pressuring, of course, continental Europeans to cut ties with China, with Russia. And like it or not, Germany has to consolidate European peninsula, because that's a matter of fact. This is what is being, the situation. Either consolidate and have a European project on that we will have a major social deconstruct, turmoil, and so on. So Germany then will need Poland and the security in the East. So in both scenarios, with the US in Europe and without US in Europe, the space will be negotiated with Russia by force. I'm not talking about war, but about force, power. Mm-hmm. So it's much better to wake up earlier than later. So whether Germans like it or not, if they want to have the European project, they would need to have the buffer zone in the East, because Russia will negotiate by force the political space, like in Ukraine or in Belarus, and that will undermine the German stability anyway. So I think that the intermarium concept will get back to German debate quite quickly.
I hope so. I'm totally on your side here. I mean, I'm just a bit. I've expressed my frustration about earlier attempts to introduce that.
And the second question, of course, I'm biased. I'm based in Warsaw. Poles are always biased vis-a-vis Russia. But why is this concept that Russia must be dragged into the European politics? They don't have any leverage on European politics. So why do Western powers invite Russia for their own balancing maneuvers, like Macron? Actually, Russia is not a European power. And if we have Ukraine and Belarus and Baltic states, they're out of the game. I mean, why bother? I understand energy, but okay, what else? There is nothing right now that would make them the European power. Not economy, not sophistication of technology, not even the market, if we have China. So why bother? I mean, I just wonder if these are not the old mental maps of the 19th century and the 20th century, when Russia, after Catherine the Great, became European power after swallowing old Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it became the European power, needed for balancing Napoleon, so on and so forth. But now, why bother?
My suspicion is that simply, this sort of balancing and geopolitical approach that you have to world politics is simply not there, or at least not in this form in Berlin and perhaps in France. I'm not sure about. I don't know France well enough. It's more like I think the idea here is Russia is simply geographically too close to the European Union. And we should therefore try to include Russia into this European neighborhood policy. And there was this proposal when the ENP was created to include Russia, and which Russia then declined. But there is this idea that basically Russia has to be part of it. And of course, there are also Russians, and there have been Russian politicians, and there have been phases in Russian history where this looked more likely than earlier. Yeah. So I think Yeltsin was still a politician who, and also Gorbachev, these were politicians, and Kozyrev, and who had a different worldview than the current leadership in Russia. And so I guess the hope is here that that this could change again in Moscow, and that you would then have again this sort of these Russian Europeans, if you want to call them this way, the intellectuals and the politicians, the think tankers who are pro-European, that they would again have a larger importance. And then I guess there's, I would say from the German perspective here, it's at the end of the day, it's mostly about security. It's the idea that it's better we have the Russians in some sort of European structure, and it is, of course, in the OECD and in the Council of Europe, and maybe we should also have an association agreement with Russia, because that will make a country like Germany more secure. Because then we can sort of, we can support the resilience of a hopefully democratic and less aggressive Russia in the future. So I guess that is more this sort of thinking. It's not so much about balancing. This sort of balancing approach is you find more often in Washington, where there's now a discussion about whether Russia should actually be included into some sort of all-Christian alliance against China. This sort of Kissinger has among others this idea that you need Russia to balance China. I guess that is not the way let's say German politicians think about Eastern Europe. I think it's much more about having some sort of stability in Eastern Europe, and the idea is then that you can reach that by including Russia. Maybe the same goes for France. Maybe that is why Macron has been making these sort of offers to Russia last year and continues to make them, which with the current leadership I think are going to go nowhere, because they Putin and the people around him are going to basically ask for a too high a price from the EU, namely some sort of hegemonic role in the former Soviet space for Russia, especially with regard to Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And the EU cannot deliver that. The EU cannot say, we're going to disregard international law for a good relationship with you. So in a way, this is a ridiculous approach, both from Macron's side and also from Putin's side, because it's the price is simply too high, as I see it. But in the long-term future, I would actually support the idea that Russia should be included. It has to be a different Russia, of course, and it has to observe international law above all.
Yeah, of course, the question is who will be the arbiter of the international law if the United States is not arbiter anymore, or is not going to be such arbiter anymore. And that's why the zero-sum game kicks in, so well known here in the Intermarium. And history of Europe is a zero-sum game, basically. So the last 30 years is just a paradise phenomenon, and it's ending a bit.
Yes.
Of course, I would like this to last forever, but it's not. As regards French and Macron, we are watching here in Warsaw with curiosity how Macron is thinking that he has any leverage in Central and Eastern Europe. He's talking to Putin about what, actually. I think the Turks are giving the French the lesson that you need to be in the region to really have influence. So in Eastern Mediterranean, you know what the French is happening to the French in the Eastern Mediterranean from Turks. And Macron is talking to Putin to counterbalance the Turkish actions. So this is exactly in par excellence the situation when Russia is being invited to the French game against, in the name of French interests in Libya, against Turks, okay? Because the only thing Russia has is the military power projection somehow, and it's a good balancing factor. So power politics has never stopped to exist, but it of course has different faces. And I just wonder, I still navigate around this question, German question, so to speak, using the old terminology. What will Germans do? Because the future of Europe is again in the German hands. Although Germany doesn't want to have a power projection capabilities, although Germans like to depict themselves as being so benign and peaceful after the last war. But you know, the structure of the system is pushing Germany to make this decision. And this decision will be very consequential also for Poland and Ukraine, and Belarus, and Russia, and all Europe, and for China, and also for the US-China showdown. So what do you think? Will Germans allow the Americans to pressure the German industry and stop and cut ties with China? Because this is what is looming on the horizon. What would
I don't know enough about it. I don't know about, I mean, this triangle, Europe, US, China, it's complicated. I mean, there's also a lot of critique of China in Germany. I mean, it's not that this is simply a universally softer, more dovish approach to China. There's a discussion about Hong Kong in Germany, but the approach is here different. That the way to go is through creating economic interdependence, and that is how you get influence. And that is, I guess, what lies at the basis of much of these German approaches towards Russia and also to China, that you trade with them, and this then will create security, and this will calm down conflicts, because you have this mutual economic dependence. That is the philosophy about it. The other thing here, maybe to come back to Ukraine here, is that Germany observed very much this kind of policy with regard to its own policy towards Russia, not noting that with the first Nord Stream pipeline, it destroyed economic interdependence between Ukraine and Russia, and thereby arguably prepared the Russian advance into Ukraine, because Russia was not as dependent on the Ukrainian gas transportation system after Nord Stream 1 went online as it used to be before Nord Stream 1. And now Germany is going to repeat this mistake with Nord Stream 2. But that is maybe just a sidekick. In general, I think the Germans believe that trade and interaction and economic interdependence creates more stable international relations. And there's a whole theory about this, which is actually also popular in the US, in US international relations. So I'm not sure where Germany will go in all this, because on the other side, of course, China is now becoming more assertive internationally, and this assertiveness is something that the Germans also don't like, this sort of intrusion of other countries or even subversion of other countries with these investments is also something disliked in Germany. But I don't know, frankly, I don't know enough about German-Chinese relations and the German approach to this American-Chinese confrontation to comment competently about it.
Before we wrap up, as the time is completely remorseless and inevitably we're sailing to the end, I was involved a few years ago in a great infrastructure project in Poland, and we were supposed to create the new strategic flows across Western Ukraine to Romania and connect the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea for power projection, but also for trading, connecting the completely different economic zone of the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea through Warsaw, Lwów, and Podole to Constanza and Bucharest. So what do you think, based in Kiev? What would Ukrainians say about that? What Germans would say about that? Because what the Russians would say about that, I know, but what would be the reaction of Germans and Ukrainians?
Well, the Ukrainians would certainly like it. I think what they mainly complain here is a lack of all countries located, a lack of interest of all countries located to the west of Ukraine for Ukraine, which includes basically everybody from Poland to Canada, so to say. They want more anything from anywhere, from anybody, and whatever there's going to be, whether it's going to be with Germany or without Germany, or whether it's going to be something within the EU or within the Three Seas initiative, that is at the end of the day for Ukrainians secondary question. It's more about what's going to be done and how much is it going to include Ukraine, and what the exact institutional framework for this is at the end of the day, which is a rational approach is I would say is secondary, as long as it works and it brings some real results. I guess the Germans would, with regard to these sort of initiatives, been supportive as long as it does not concern some sort of hard power military issues. Then they would become maybe hesitant. If Poland would let's say sign an agreement like Turkey has with Azerbaijan about mutual aid. Turkey as a NATO member, and if Poland would sign something like that with Ukraine, I think then the Germans would start to worry, because then they would start asking, okay, are we then going to be part of all of that through NATO?
And Andreas, let me. This is a very good hypothetical situation, because that's quite manageable. The Ukrainians may want to have the alliance with Poland, and if we see that Germany doesn't pay money, and Germany doesn't want the US and Europe, and Germany doesn't deter Russia, then then you search for force to survive, and then there will be regional alliances. This is the end result of a German position towards NATO. That it may end up like that, by the way.
Well, as I said, I guess for the Germans would support anything that is not getting military in a way. That is where the Germans would become very hesitant. But from the East European perspective, I think what maybe the East Europeans should tell the Germans more forcefully, I guess you and others have been doing that already, is that simply, you live here in this area of the world in a different part of the world than in Berlin, where you're surrounded by friendly countries with whom you have lots of trade and nobody has any territorial pretensions, and there's very little geopolitics in Central Europe now. If you define Central Europe as being sort of the territory around Germany, in Central Eastern Europe, the geopolitics is very different. And maybe if the Germans would understand that, this is simply something that they don't understand, then they would perhaps, not take actively part, but that at least they would not interfere. That is perhaps what one could try to ask from Berlin, not to mingle into an area that Germany doesn't really understand well. At least not the logic of this sort of gray zone politics here in this area. But I would at the end of the day I would defend the Germans because they have a different traditions. That's how they are, and they have become after World War II, and maybe for the better. And they do here a lot in Ukraine. So there's a lot of German presence here. It's just not the kind of presence that the Ukrainians would prefer most. They would prefer, as strange as that may sound, perhaps German tanks here rather than German political foundations and cultural institutes and German projects and decentralization and all of these nice sounding stuff about culture and democratic governance and so on, because here the main issue is plain security, national security, the major issue, and that is not something that the Germans are as engaged as the Ukrainians wish. But still, the Germans are here, big, and they are maybe the most engaged country here in many regards. If you look at the at scholarships, at support for the decentralization program, there are a whole number of areas where German support for Ukraine is actually on top. It's not the most salient issues, often not the most salient issues for Ukraine, but still. The Germans are doing something that they can do within their logic of foreign policy and geopolitical thinking, if you want to use that term.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you very much for the conversation. Our guest today was Andreas Umland. I hope that I will, make you appear again in our, our panels. That was fascinating.
It was my pleasure and my honor to speak to you, and I'll be happy to come online again.
Thank you very much, and stay tuned to Strategy and Future.